Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live podcast interview. This topic we're going to cover here today is called Lessons from Executives Going Through Transformation. We're going to dive into the topics of executive alignment, executive support, and basically what do executives need to do to make transformation initiatives successful. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. But first, a couple logistical items. I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. We host this live interview every Tuesday, same time, same place. We're streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram here today. So thank you for joining. And wherever you're joining from here today, I encourage you to drop in the chat where you're joining from. Or I encourage you to drop questions in the chat as we go through the conversation here today. So we're going to start off with some questions I have, but really it's your time here today. And we'd love to hear your questions and comments as it relates to executive alignment and support throughout digital transformations. This podcast will become part of the weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. Every Wednesday, we release new episodes of that podcast, and this interview, which we're producing live here today, will become part of that podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow. So be sure to check out transformationgroundcontrol.com for past episodes of the show, as well as this episode when it drops. Again, that's transformationgroundcontrol.com. Again, our topic here today is lessons from executives going through transformation. I'd love to hear from the audience before I introduce our guest, though. I'd love to hear from the audience. Where are you joining from today? What city and country are you from? We typically have a global audience, and I love hearing where everyone's at here today. I already hear from Rahesh that he's joining from St. Martin. So thank you for being here today. Love to hear where you're all joining from here today. So just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. Love to hear from you. And then, of course, as you have questions throughout the conversation, please drop those in the chat. And hello, Gary from the UK, joining on YouTube. I appreciate you dropping in the chat where you're from. So joining us today to discuss this topic of lessons from executives going through transformation is Bruce Siegel, who is managing partner at Karrikins Group. Bruce, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Excited to have you on this show for the first time. We've known each other a long time, but this is the first time we're having this sort of more formal podcast interview. So thanks for being here. Before we jump into the questions surrounding executive alignment, executive support, all that good stuff, maybe tell us a little bit about you and about Karrikins Group.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, when you first approached me about the topic, Eric, it really reminded me probably about 20 years ago when we first met. You were running a massive digital transformation for Samsonite. I was the account exec for the same consulting company that we worked for. And our paths took very different turns. Yours, where it ended up now, is with Third Stage, helping organizations really with the important work and the massive amount of work that surrounds digital transformations. And mine, which now led me to Karrikins Group. And at Karrikins Group, we help leaders really figure out how they need to lead, whether it's for a digital transformation or any transformation where they're trying to drive growth. I've been leading Karrikins Group for about 9 years now. Prior to that, I had about 30 plus years leading various consulting practices, whether internationally or here in the US. Karrikins Group is this interesting intersection. We're a combination of a behavior change firm, a consulting firm, and a leadership firm. And all of that comes together with helping leaders really understand how do they lead, how do they drive growth and transformation through the power of alignment.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it is very interesting how it is such a small world here in the world of transformation. I mean, you and I sort of started off in a similar spot, or we were at a similar spot 20 years ago. We sort of ran in parallel for a while, and here we are crossing paths again. So I suppose once you're in this industry, it's hard to stray far from it. But just real quick before I get to my first questions here for you, Bruce, just to turn to the audience for a second. I mentioned that Rahesh is joining from St. Martin, Gary from the UK, Carol from Boulder, Kate from Denver, Varun from India, Alcinda from South Africa, Julie from Denver. I think you know Julie, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
I think you know her pretty well. She on your team. So people from all over the world here today, thank you for joining. If you haven't dropped in the chat, love to hear where you're joining from here today. So maybe just to help us set the context and sort of the backdrop here for the conversation, and be curious to hear what the audience thinks in terms of questions and comments here too. But if we just sort of back up and look at the concept of executive involvement in any sort of transformation initiative, I think we all kind of know that it's important, but maybe you could just help explain or unpack a little bit why it's so important to be successful, or why is it so important to have that executive involvement and that positive engagement to make a transformation successful. Why is that?
Yeah, it's almost crucial, and without executive involvement and really executive alignment, it's very difficult for any transformation to reach the outcomes that it really wants. A lot of times with major transformations, these are very ambitious goals that executives are setting for the organization and asking a lot of individuals to participate in and successfully execute on. And without the executive involvement, it's difficult to overcome all the barriers. What we like to say is executives need to make a worthy ask of their employees and any of the stakeholders that are involved in that. And for it to be a worthy ask, they really need to provide clarity around what is it that we're trying to achieve. And then through that, how do they create connection and commitment to achieving those goals, and for themselves to show the courage of what it's going to mean, what are the changes that they're going to need to make this transformation successful. Without executive involvement throughout the entire transformation, and quite honestly, we've seen a lot of programs where executives start out where there's a lot of initial push, but that push dies off as they're off, as we say, doing more important things, when the reality is they need to be much more involved from a continuous basis, and we would call that a successful simmer.
Right. So when you think about executives that are going through transformations and when they're first starting off and when they're kind of getting their heads around how we're going to lead this change. And by the way, I'm going to back up a second. I ask you this question because you and I have talked about how my perception of your role and what Karrikins does, it's almost like you're an executive whisperer in some ways. You're coaching executives. You're sort of working one-on-one with them to help them understand what they need to do to be successful and do some of the things you just mentioned. But when you are approaching these executives and they're just getting started on a transformation and they're trying to get their arms around how to lead, how would you describe the state of mind typically of executives? Like, just especially if we're not executives, if I'm on a project team or I'm a mid-level manager and I'm trying to understand what my executives are going through, what they're thinking, how would you describe that or unpack that for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult to come up with one state of mind. It depends on the executive. It depends on how long they've been in the role. It depends on, quite honestly, how secure they are in their capabilities. We see different mindsets. On the one side of the mindset is they've seen a lot of their predecessors potentially fail at various transformations, and some of the organizations that we consult with, these are board level transformations where the board has to approve these major multi-year investments, whether they're big acquisitions, whether they're big digital transformations, whether internally or externally. And a lot of them have seen their predecessors try to push and drive similar large efforts, and their tenure may have been short. And so they don't want to be their predecessor or their predecessor's predecessor. And so that's in the back of their mind. I mean, I think we need to remember how risky some of these endeavors are. On the flip side, there's a lot of executives who are very growth mindset and really looking at how do they create the space for the employees to thrive and their stakeholders and customers to thrive. And this is a very natural evolution of where they want to take their company. So mindsets vary very differently.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in the hot seat mentality or the reality that so many executives are in the hot seat because their predecessors failed. I think that's a really good point worth noting. A lot of executives are brought into the organization because either someone failed before them or strategically the company is floundering a bit, and they're brought in to make a change and to do something bold that previous people couldn't. So do you sense that executives in that role, like, I know it's probably hard to generalize across all the executives you work with, but in general, is there a certain amount of confidence that goes with that? Is there a certain amount of fear? Is it like, how would you describe the psyche of an executive in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, again, varies dramatically. I think some depends on their tenure at the executive level. We have seen a lot of executives, even if they have a growth mindset, they're also afraid potentially to be looked at as a cheerleader where they're too optimistic, potentially on the bordering of delusional. And so what we look to is working with executives is how do they be intentionally optimistic? Intentionally optimistic is this really beautiful blend of being realistic and knowing what's possible in the future. Being realistic, this is going to be really hard. This is going to take a long time. And we have the right resources, we've got the right attention, we've got the right intellect to really overcome those challenges and probably do what might not be possible for a lot of other organizations.
Yeah, I love that term, intentionally optimistic. That's a great term. I might steal that or license it from you if you don't mind.
Feel free, as long as you credit back.
Right, exactly. And I love to hear from the audience too, what you think. What is the state of mind of a lot of the executives you're working with, whatever executive team or executive sponsor you're working with? What's sort of the state of mind or behavior are you seeing from your executives? I'd love to hear from the audience on that. And speaking of the audience, this is a great question from Gary that I want to ask you here, Bruce. Gary on YouTube asked, why are executives so resistant to change around digital transformations? Is it the perception of losing control through new, more transparent processes, or is this just a UK thing? And this is an interesting question because we're talking about resistance to change, which typically we think resistance to change is going to come from further down the organization. But here he's asking executives themselves, why are they resistant to change? Is this something you see often, or how would you respond to Gary here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any one group of individuals is resistant to change or accepting of change. I think it's very much, it's not categorized by the role they have as an executive. We also have to be conscious of executives. They're trying to move a lot of different efforts along, and digital transformation may be one of many things that they're trying to do. So, a lot of the executives we work with, they're at the C-suite. Some have very large publicly traded organizations, and you have to think about the various pulls on their time and attention and focus. And so digital transformation, while is very important to the organization, it might be one of many very important things that they're working on. So I wouldn't categorize as executives as being generally just resistant to change. They may not understand the amount of focus and attention that's required to it. To Gary's question, there's also some executives who it's difficult for them to start changing their behaviors and how they do their job. So in the case of digital transformation, if you're talking about the CFO, in many cases, the CFO needs to dramatically change how they operate. Whether they're used to spreadsheets or their own source of record for the data, and now they're asking the organization to go enterprise-wide with an ERP system. They now need to manage differently. They now need to manage their folks and lead their folks differently so that everyone's using the capabilities of the solution, not just the people in the front line. The executives now need to know how are they going to lead differently. And that's a lot of the work we do is what are the behavioral commitments that executive need to make as a collective as well as an individual. And really, how do they start with self? How do they show that this is an important effort by signaling that they're also going to change the way they operate internally and externally?
Right. That makes total sense. Want to say hi to Adam from Montreal, Srinivas from India, Ashish from Singapore. Thanks for joining here today. So we've got people continuing to join from all over the world. Thanks for chiming in here today. So, one thing I've found in my experience or career, and I'm curious to see what you think here, Bruce, and if you have seen this before or how you've dealt with this, but a lot of times you get executives that have this right mindset, and let's just say they have the intentional optimism that you described. Let's just say we start off on the right foot. We've got the right men's mindset. We have the right intentions as an executive team, but then sometimes there's like a misunderstanding of what's to come. Like they don't necessarily understand how a transformation is going to affect the organization and how the organization is going to respond and what their role should continue to be, other than providing that right mindset and that right leadership. There's more to it, to provide that executive sponsorship and buy-in and support. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings do you think that executives have, or what are the blind spots they have typically when they go into transformations like this?
I think, from my experience, a lot depends on how the transformation is set up. I think a lot of executives don't dedicate the dedicated resources to the transformation. And in some ways, these big transformations become what we would call a side hustle to their day-to-day job. So I think sometimes there's a lack of understanding of how do you keep the business moving while also doing this transformation. And it's very difficult for the same group of resources to do both. And so sometimes there's a misunderstanding around that. I wouldn't say it's all the time, but there's definitely a misunderstanding sometimes in that space. I think also there's a very big difference between change enablement and change management. I think a lot of executives believe that if they put a change program in place and they are helping individuals react to the change, as opposed to changing the culture and saying, okay, how do we become changeable? How do we, in a continuous way, look at probably transformation is going to happen all the time, whether it's big T or little t transformation. And how do we create a culture that really embraces this transformation and creates and leans into this transformation, so it's a continuous effort?
Right. That's a great point. And yeah, it's that continuous mindset and that understanding of what, the proactive versus the reactive aspect that you're talking about, proactively getting the organization ready for change and the change enablement. I think that's super interesting, because I think you're right. We do, as transformation practitioners and as leaders, oftentimes we think of this as a way that we're going to respond to the resistance. We'll respond to the organization when there's negativity or when there's concern or pushback or whatever. But what you're saying is get ahead of that and create a culture that is open to change and is able to adapt a little bit better. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're right. Change practitioners are probably at the center of that challenge. Yeah. We've created a whole practice of helping individuals deal with change, as opposed to helping individuals embrace change and be part of that change and create the change. And so what that just brought to mind is this whole concept of WIFM. So what's in it for me? As change practitioners, we spend a lot of time defining how this is going to improve the employee's way of being within their current job. I think what we don't do, and a lot of executives can lean into this, is how do we create clarity around what does this mean to our customers? What does this mean to our company? What does this mean to our industry? And how do we broaden that, what we would call worthy ask? How do we make this transformation be something that's just a dramatic positive effect on all of the constituents that deal with our organization?
Right. Yeah, very, very interesting. Here's a follow-up comment from Gary, just sort of in response to what you just said, Bruce. But Gary on YouTube says, I would say 80% of execs that I have worked with at big companies in the UK, public and private sector, are very resistant. I tend to find that people lower down are more open. It's a super interesting comment. Do you find that to be the case, where you have some clients where the organization does have that mindset of change and they're ready for change, and then the executives are resistant? Have you seen that in your career?
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's 20% or 80%, I couldn't say, but yeah, there's definitely executives who are resistant to change. One of the things that we've seen is, again, it depends on the tenure. So as executives get further in their tenure, so as they're looking 5, 7, 8 years out, and they've been in that role, they may be looking about how do they transition out of this role? How do they retire? What's their legacy? And then as they get to the end of their career, they might be a little bit more resistant to change. There's a great article from McKinsey that I can post if you like, Eric,
Sure.
that really talks about how do CEOs and more broader, how do executives keep their learning agenda going? And they specifically talk about executives post 5 years, especially if they've been highly successful. They look at, there's a gravity. One of the terms we have is there's a gravity to that success. And they may be a little bit more reluctant to mess with that success by continuing the transformation and continuing the change. Right. And so part of that learning agenda is CEOs and executives, how do they get outside their organization? How do they shadow other executives from other industries to see how other businesses are growing and transforming? And that's just one example from the article, but it's a great article from McKinsey.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. And if anyone I don't know if you can post it or if anyone from your team can
Yeah.
post it in the chat, that'd be a great supplemental resource for the audience
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. And Eric, it also brought another thing to mind. There's this concept of finite and infinite. There was a book back in the mid 80s by a guy named James Carse, not a very well known author or author or publication. And I believe the book was called Infinite and Finite Games. And Simon Sinek popularized this idea of infinite games with his book that came out in the mid to late 2000s, 2019, I think. And it talks about this mindset. Do you have a finite mindset or an infinite mindset? And if you think about businesses, and especially publicly traded companies, they are built on a construct of things in quarters and annual timeframes because they've got to report to their shareholders. Executives, and if you can help executives think more of an infinite mindset, and that looks at the infinite game is the game is never over. And the purpose of the game, and they just call it a game, but the purpose of business is how do you bring more stakeholders into the success of this organization? And that may take 1, 2, 3, 10 years, 100 years. And so helping individuals, whether at the executive level or at any level in the organization, think more in the infinite mindset is a lot of times very helpful. And even just bringing up that concept, because you have to do both. You have to operate in some instances in a finite setting, but if you change your mindset to be more infinite, it helps expand the options and actually makes change a lot less risky.
That's super interesting. I had not heard that concept before, but it makes sense as you're describing it, but it's one of those subtle but really important shifts in thinking, I'd imagine. Here's an interesting comment. I'm going to see if I can fit it. It will not fit on the screen, but I'll read it anyway. This is from Alcinda on LinkedIn. It's a great comment. She says, I get the sense that because they are in leadership positions, that they are meant to direct the posture of the organization. This manifests in some sort of fear that they need to have the answers to all the questions, but these transformations need to go through an iterative process and come with uncertainties. So it would be an unfair expectation of them. So maybe just to frame that into a question, if you're an executive, how do you deal with that, or how do you address the fact that there's a lot of stuff you don't know as a leader and people are looking to you as a leader to have that clarity? But these projects, as Alcinda rightly mentions, they come with uncertainty. There's a lot of unknowns we're still trying to define. How do you deal with that as an executive?
Yeah, I love that question. And what I would say is one of the most important roles of the executive and the executive team is to what we would call create the space for quality conversations. The executives writ large don't need to have all the answers. They've hired really smart people, and usually there's a lot of people working on these transformations. And if the executives literally create the space for quality conversations, which means how do you create an environment where people feel comfortable to be honest, to provide their perspective on how things are going? Probably the worst thing for any transformation is when everything's green, because everything is never green. And if everything is, typically everything's not green. There's no absolute. Right. But if everything's green, you have to ask the question, is there fear in the organization or fear within groups of the organization that if it's not green, will there be ramifications to it? And so if the executives have created the space for quality conversations, creating the environment where there's no repercussions for talking about where things might not be going well, that would probably be one of the most important things that we would talk to executives about. What can they do to make sure that this transformation, quite honestly, their organization is highly successful?
Right. Well, and there's also a lot of power and merit in an executive saying, I don't know. We don't yet have an answer to whatever it is, whatever the unknown is. But setting that expectation with the organization and maybe setting that back to that intentional optimism, an executive can say that, hey, this is going to transform our business and here's all the ways that we're going to make our business better. However, there are going to be challenges along the way. You sort of have to set the expectation that this isn't going to be all unicorns and rainbows. This isn't going to be an easy ride. It is going to be a lot of work, but I have faith in you as a team. We're going to figure this out together. That sort of messaging, I think, can be very powerful rather than trying to pretend like you have all the answers. And when you start to pretend like you have all the answers and then you don't, I think that's where you start to
Yeah.
get into trouble.
Yeah, I agree. First off, Eric, excellent job in talking about what intentional optimism is. It almost sounds like you read some of the material. So well done.
Exactly. See how fast I steal your idea? It only takes me
Yeah.
seconds to steal your ideas, Bruce.
Well done. This other concept, other mindset just came to mind for me. When the question talked about fear, we also have to remember that within the executive ranks, a lot of times there's a group dynamic amongst their own peers that one executive may feel like they've got a concern or a fear that if they don't have the answer for their peers, that they're going to be looked upon as not being competent. So this fear, I think, potentially goes throughout organizations. And one of the group dynamics, which we would say is a misaligned group dynamic based on our behavior change model, one of those misaligned group dynamics of fear is one of the things that we definitely address. And how do you address that? By creating much more confidence, creating this environment for quality conversations, having just a realistic perspective that there needs to be progress, not perfection. And
Right.
in any one conversation, I may or may not have all the answers.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. Here's an interesting question from Sid on LinkedIn. Sid says, from your perspective, how do you delineate the vision of many executives who may have short or near-term goals, as you just mentioned, Bruce, to the goals of a digital transformation, which is often a continual process? So it sort of gets back to Alcinda's point too. There's a lot of stuff we don't know yet about this transformation. We don't know how it's going to unfold. We don't know yet how it's going to impact the organization necessarily. So how do you connect the dots here between the vision or the goals, short-term or long-term, to the digital transformation itself?
Yeah, I mean, we would engage in a conversation with those executives around, okay, what's the destination that you're looking to achieve for this organization? And what we would talk about is what's your strategic destination? So 3 to 5 years out, where do you want to go with this organization, not just with this transformation? And then how do you lead through that destination? Don't lead just to that destination, because even if you're 3 to 5 years out, you could start bringing in some finite mindset and finite thinking, but lead through that. But know that that's one destination, that's one stop along this potentially 10, 20, 100-year path that we're trying to get to. So it's linking back to what are the ambitious goals that this executive team and this organization is trying to achieve.
Right. Yeah. And here's kind of a funny comment from Alcinda as a follow-up on LinkedIn. She says, my supervisor calls this temporary incompetence that uncertainty comes with. So it's an interesting choice of words. I don't know if I'd call it incompetence if I were a leader, but I see the point there. It does kind of make sense. There's stuff we don't know for sure as we go through a transformation.
Well, yeah, and that's absolutely true. And I think part of the work that you guys do is how do you look at continuing to look out? And I think some of the combinations between what you do and what we do is we look at, if you're going to develop a strategy, if you're going to develop a plan, how do you build in very regular course corrections and make that not only an okay part, but a necessary part of the transformation? I think the days are gone where you spend 18 months developing a plan, developing a strategy, and then you spend the next 5 years implementing that. What we see is now things are much more agile. Strategies, even for large enterprise organizations, are developed in weeks, maybe a few months. And the most advanced organizations and executives are looking at it at a minimum on a quarterly basis. How are we creating regular course corrections? And it's not a bad thing. And that's get rid of the stigma that if we're tacking and changing course, that's not a bad thing. That's actually expected.
Right. Yeah. What about, we've talked about the way organizations and leaders and executives should be on a transformation and how they should lead. Why do so many organizations struggle with a lack of executive involvement or buy-in? Because that does seem to be a common root cause for failure, is that the executives aren't on board or they're not supporting the project the way they should. Even if they start off with the right mindset that you're talking about, oftentimes it doesn't translate into the execution that needs to happen from the executive team. So why is that?
Well, I think part of it is how much time is spent on what the transformation is. not only what it is, but also how are we going to accomplish it? So the more lower level initiatives, and then some time is spent on why is this important? And we just see very little time, typically in relative terms, is spent, how do we need to lead to make this transformation successful? So it's a bit of a mindset shift. If the executives, and specifically the most senior executives, really start articulating the why, and what we talked about earlier, not only the why internally, but probably more importantly, the why externally. How is this going to transform the industry? How is this going to transform our experience for our customers? Really making that word the ask. And at the same time, looking at how do we need to lead? And very specifically, how do we need to lead collectively in an aligned way? Without doing that very dedicated work, it just doesn't happen. There are other people that are going to go off on the why and the what, but the executives really need to focus on, at every level within the organization, these leadership teams really need to focus on collectively, how are we going to model the way? How are we going to start with self? And how are we going to hold each other accountable to the behaviors that we know we need to demonstrate that's actually going to make the transformation successful?
Yeah. Very, very well said. What about executive alignment? Maybe you could help us understand this concept. I know your colleague Julie was on this podcast recently, and she talked a lot about executive alignment. For those that may have missed that discussion, though, what is executive alignment, and why is it so important to transformation?
Yeah, we look at executive alignment and any alignment under a couple competencies. We look at clarity, connection, commitment, and courage, and we call those the 4 C's. Every firm, every consulting firm has to have various models, and that's one of our models.
You probably have a PowerPoint slide too, right?
Actually, we use very little PowerPoint slides.
Oh, okay.
So that's it's probably, it's more in a methodology and a model that people can visualize, but we use very little in the PowerPoint space. PowerPoint is not our programming language of choice anymore.
Right.
But this concept of clarity is really interesting, and alignment starts with clarity. And most individuals, and executives are no different, most individuals believe once they're clear and they state that to others, that clarity has been created. But the reality is, unless you are able to get individuals into a dialogue, and that dialogue helps create shared meaning, that there is no clarity. Clarity does not exist. Because clarity of one does not mean that it's clear on what we're going to do, why we're doing it, and how we're going to do it. And so that shared meaning might be is a very important aspect of creating alignment. So we start with clarity, and within clarity, there's also this concept of how do you create the invisible visible? There are a lot of things that are going on internally within folks that create this idea of misaligned group dynamics, misaligned mindsets, and how do you bring those to the forefront? And then how do you then address those things that might not be aligned to where you want to go? So 2 aspects of clarity is this idea of shared meaning and making the invisible visible.
Right.
The next element of alignment we would look at is connection. So how do you create the connection for all of the individuals that are going to go on this transformation journey to be able to connect the dots? Connect the dots from a function perspective. How is this transformation going to change various things, and how do they interrelate? And as important, how do you connect the dots between people and that intersection of people? Because if it's truly transformative, it's going to affect many aspects of the organization. And so without that interconnectivity across functions, it'll be very difficult to be successful. A next element of alignment we look at is commitment. And how do you show commitment? How do you hold yourself and others accountable to this goal that you're setting and the behaviors that it's going to take to achieve those? And last is courage. One element of courage is, first of all, how do you start with self? A little bit overused term is how do you be more vulnerable? But really, how do you be more transparent about what's happening? Why is it happening? What's my part in this? And then lastly, what I mentioned earlier, this idea of this idea of creating the space for quality conversations. Alignment requires individuals and executive teams to solve the avoided. So what are the things that are either not being discussed or not fully explored, whether it's based on what we talked earlier, the fear of retribution or the fear of bringing up that something's yellow or red, or it's just my own personal concern that I'm an introvert and I might not want to talk in front of a group, whatever it might be, whatever those reasons that things are being avoided. Part of the executive team's responsibility and the ability to create alignment is cataloging those things that are being avoided and then systematically addressing them.
That's super interesting. So summarize again for those of us taking notes. What are the 4 C's again? Just could you run through those real quick again?
Sure. Clarity, commitment, connection, and courage.
Okay. So coming back to the clarity one then, do you run into a situation often or ever where you go into an executive boardroom or you meet with an executive team and the clarity isn't there, not because they don't want to create the clarity, but because maybe they're not on the same page with what the transformation means to the organization and how they want to?
Yes.
Okay. So help us understand that.
Yeah. So a lot of times there's either a lack of understanding or probably more specifically a different set of understanding around what the transformation is. There's also a situation where people understand what the transformation is, but they believe the transformation is for others, not for themselves. And so within our process of creating alignment, we literally facilitate co-creation sessions where we get executives into dialogue around what is this transformation? What does it mean to the broader organization? What does it mean externally? And then bringing it back home. What does it mean to this executive team? And what does it mean individually to each of the executives? And quite honestly, if each of the executives isn't going to have to change, whether it's how they lead, whether it's how they're directing resources, where it's how they're putting their own time and energy, it is probably not transformative or transformative enough. And so we have this concept of agreement versus alignment. And most individuals, most leaders confuse agreement for alignment. So agreement is just like you just did, Eric, you shook your head when I said something.
Right.
I actually don't know if you're aligned with what I'm saying. All I know is that you agree with what I'm saying. And it might be tacit. It might be tacit agreement. And unless you really start diving into what are the finer points, the details around the transformation, and how is it going to affect me personally as an executive? How is it going to affect my function? How is it going to affect the organization? And understanding what am I going to do differently, and really aligning to showing up and being different, behaving different, putting my time, effort, and energy in different spaces. There probably is no alignment. There's probably agreement. And agreement could be very risky and detrimental to an organization if you don't do the hard work of alignment.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point. And it actually reminds me a lot of when you're talking about the nodding of the head, it reminded me of the case study. I think I studied in sociology. I think maybe it's a business class, but the case study where there was a plane crash, I think it was in South Korea. And it was a situation where the pilot, the co-pilot had a concern about something that was going wrong with the flight. And the pilot basically overrode the co-pilot because of the hierarchy and the cultural differences, the cultural hierarchy in businesses in parts of Asia in this case study. And it was talking about how the communication and the agreement and the alignment didn't happen because of cultural nuances. Yes. Do you ever see that in different parts of the world? I can imagine where someone nods their head and you think, okay, they're agreeing and aligned. But to your point, it might be the points you just made might be even more true in certain cultures throughout the world, I would imagine. Is that something you see as well? Absolutely.
I see it. Yeah, we see it across the board. We see it in our domestic in the US. We see it in international communities. It will show up differently. So just as an example, many years ago, I was living in Europe running a European e-commerce practice. And I had probably 30 folks from different countries. No three individuals were from the same country. So mix and match of a lot of native cultures around the world. And if you some of those individuals were from much more what we would call tribal cultures, and in those cultures, it's very difficult to speak against the chief. And in this situation, I was the chief. I was running the practice. It was an e-business practice. I was running that practice, and I had to be very deliberate about how do I elicit varying opinions from myself. And executives all over the world need to be very explicit about how do they do that. How do they lean into creating a space for quality conversations like we talked before? And part of what they have to do is they have to be explicit about, I might be showing up in a conversation and I might be providing my opinion. I'm not creating a vote. I'm not giving my vote for something, or I'm not deciding something. And if an executive or any individual is not being explicit about, this is my opinion, I would love to hear your opinion, and let's figure this out together, they're not going to be able to, especially in some of these other cultures and some Asian cultures, as you've just articulated, they're not going to be able to elicit the amount of dialogue to create shared meaning, to create alignment. So they have to work extra hard to really articulate and slow down and say, where are they coming from? What they're coming from is, this is my opinion. I really value your opinion. We're going to come to this decision together. Or in other instances, this is what I believe I'm going to make my decision on. I'd love to get your input, and I'm still going to make my decision. So they just have to be explicit when they're creating that alignment. It also made me think of, there are skills and capabilities we've all learned, especially folks who've been in the job force for a long time, who've learned through industrial management techniques. Many of those leaders have learned to drive change through command and control. And what we know now is that leadership style that has a time and place, but more often now leaders need to lead through influence. And the skills of alignment are really the skills of leading through influence as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think a lot of times we think that, you have to be command and control, or you have to not be command and control and be more influential. And the reality is sometimes you need a mix of both, and it depends on the situation you're in, and how urgent is this transformation. If you're in a transformation that's responding to survival sort of need, then you might have a more command and control sort of approach. But if you're like most organizations, where you're just trying to get ahead, you're trying to keep up with the competition, you're trying to evolve as an organization, and maybe a little bit more organically go through the change, then you're right that you want to take less command and control, more influence, and maybe more of a bottoms up sort of approach.
Yeah. Well, your tendency may be to go command and control when things are struggling. And actually, that might be the time that you have to lean more into, how do you lead through influence?
Yeah, that's interesting. Even though it's counterintuitive, because as a leader, I think you think, no, we don't have time for influence. We've got to go now. We've got to make decisions fast and all that sort of thing. So how do you? So maybe help us understand that. How does influence help a situation like that? Let's just say it's you've got a really tough project. The transformation's kind of going off track. People, the morale's low. You're sort of in a mess. How does influence help versus command and control to get that back on track?
Yeah. So if we go back to the 4 C's and we think about clarity, another element of creating clarity is this idea of, how do you tell powerful stories? And so you can actually affect more change and inspire more people by telling powerful stories, as opposed to dictating what an individual should do. So I've, on this podcast, been trying to tell some stories about what has my experience been. That may come across better in a learning environment than me stating what a given skill might be. And so this idea of telling powerful stories, and it's a very important skill for executives and individuals who want to lead. How do you take the concept of data that's out there that you're experiencing, narratives that are being created, and how do you bring them together to create a very powerful story of the reason for change? And part of this idea of a worthy ask, and how do you put the concept of why should we be doing this, is how do you create that worthy ask? How do you inspire folks through storytelling around what will this do for our customers? What has been the challenge that our current customers have now, and maybe what's been holding us back? And what might be a much more positive future for this organization if we deliver on this transformation? So the idea of telling powerful stories, especially when things are maybe not going well, and really understanding what stories need to be archived, because we all have stories inside ourselves that may or may not be true anymore. And if they're not true to the situation and not going to be helpful going forward, how do you archive those stories? And how do you start putting out into the workforce, into the world, stories that are going to take you where you want to go?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to hear from the audience too. If you're willing to say it out loud and in a public forum, you just sort of how would you describe the leadership traits of the executives or the leadership team you're working with right now? Does it fit what Bruce is talking about here, or is there something different you're seeing? I'd love to sort of hear how would you summarize or describe the executive leadership style that you're seeing in your organization? Here, we were talking about alignment a moment ago, Bruce. And speaking of alignment, here's a really interesting and relevant comment from Gary on YouTube. And he actually said this a few minutes ago, or much earlier in the conversation, even before we got to this thread, but I thought I'd come back to it because it's very relevant to what you were talking about. But he says, yes, first of all, organizations need to create a culture that gives people a safe place to criticize without the fear of being singled out for being a troublemaker. So back to your point about culture and alignment versus, would you say it?
Agreement versus alignment.
Agreement versus alignment. How do you create that? How do you create that safe space? Especially if you're an organization that it has been historically command and control, or maybe people weren't listened to much in the past. How do you create that safe place? How do you transform to being a more collaborative culture where people can state their mind and give their opinion and be part of the solution?
Yeah, well, one of the steps up front is you need to make the invisible visible. Most people will feel that fear. Most people know it exists, but people have not put words to it. So we talk a lot about how do you notice and name things? How do you notice and name? This would be a group dynamic that would be very misaligned to most leaders and where they want to take the organization. It creates misaligned mindsets as well. And when we think about how do you change the outcomes, you need to start changing the decisions and the behaviors. To do that, you need to go all the way back to, okay, what are the misaligned mindsets and misaligned group dynamics that are getting in the way? And so this concept of fear very much permeates potentially through the organization. And what we would say is the leaders need to, one, name it, state it for the organization that it exists and that we're going to address it. And then first and foremost, address it at the leadership level. Because I would guess that if there's fear of speaking up within the organization, that's probably modeled at the leadership level. And the peers within the leadership group probably have a little bit of hesitation, if not fear, in speaking up amongst that group. And so how do you address it? Get into a quality conversation around it, notice, name it, and then start talking about what are the opposite of that behavior that we want to model for ourselves and for the broader organization, and give it a name. So it might be some easy version of we need to create the space for quality conversations, or we're going to remove fear, or progress over perfection, whatever that behavior would look like, and then talk to the organization about that. This is a behavioral commitment that we're making for ourselves. We want you to hold us accountable as we work together. We want you to hold us accountable as we work within the rest of the organization. And it's amazing how viral that will come.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Speaking of alignment and building on the alignment concept here, this is from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, does embedding reward systems improve alignment? People tend to buy into initiatives if it impacts their pockets positively or negatively, loosely speaking. So how do reward systems fit into all this that we're talking about?
Yeah, so reward systems and other things that we would call organizational factors absolutely fit into how do you change behaviors, how do you change decisions, and how do you create alignment. Reward systems and organizational factors are one element of it. And they definitely help to reinforce the alignment that you want to create. What we do know is that through just a lot of research around social science and behavioral science is most likely that's not going to create sustainable alignment. And unless you get to the individual mindsets that are misaligned and the individual group dynamics that are misaligned, if you only rely on the organizational factors, those external things to humans, the things like systems, processes, structures, reward systems, the change and the alignment to that change is not going to be sustainable.
Right. Yeah. Super interesting. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about has been focused on what executives should do and sort of, painting that picture of what good executive leadership and buy-in looks like. What about those of us that are not executives? So in other words, we might be on a project team where we're struggling to see this sort of behavior from your executive team. In other words, they're not supporting a lot of, or they're not demonstrating a lot of the behavior and characteristics that you're describing. What are some good ways or tips to manage up the organization if we're on a project team, project leader, wherever we are in the organization, but we're not executives? We're not the people that can influence change in the same way you've been describing. How can we manage up? Can we manage up? I guess would be the first question.
Absolutely. And I would say alignment's not precious to the leadership team. It's not a privilege of a leadership team. Individuals throughout the organization can create alignment. And really just going back to what we talked about before, Eric, the 4 C's. At a program level, at a team level, at an individual level, you can start practicing the skills and capabilities of alignment with your team members. How do you create clarity just within this team? How do you create commitment, connection, and show courage to deliver on this? Quite honestly, when we talked about some of the inadequacies of command and control, as opposed to leading through influence, what I would say is those individuals, if they lead through influence, they'll get noticed. It'll help them rise through the ranks of the organization if that's what they want to do, or just get more responsibility or have more influence. These skills of alignment should be utilized by everyone in the organization.
Yeah. So in other words, we don't need to sit back and wait for the executives to do what we're talking about here. We can be part of that alignment.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I would say it's a misaligned mindset. It's a mindset that I'm waiting to be led as opposed to stepping in and leading.
Right. Yeah. Because I know you like to study this topic. I know you study history of this topic, Bruce, like I like to as well. I want to come back to a comment from earlier that gets back to your point about finite versus infinite mindsets. And this is from Sid on LinkedIn. And Sid makes a comment here that infinite versus finite is indeed the case in the auto industry. For example, the Asian versus the US auto companies.
Yes.
It's a super, super interesting comment that I hadn't connected those dots, but I think that's an interesting observation. What are your thoughts there? I mean, you look at entire industries that have been disrupted and where you have a new leadership model or a new business model that comes in and disrupts, or in some cases destroys an entire industry or certainly certain competitors. Do you think a lot of that does come back to this mindset that you're talking about, the infinite versus the finite?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the auto industry is a great example where you had a lot of Asian companies who overtook the big 3 or whatever you would categorize in the US. And they did that through quality. And the idea around quality is definitely an infinite game in this. And you're not looking at how do I create the most cars in the cheapest way? Quite honestly, in the end, they were probably able to be much more effective and efficient because they looked at a much longer time horizon. And so I think the auto industry is a great example.
Yeah. Another one that comes to mind that I just read about, it's probably been 2 or 3 years now, is a Wall Street Journal article about Jeff Bezos and his CFO. And it was talking about how as they were growing Amazon, and Amazon had already been pretty well established at this point. I think this was probably, I don't know when this was, 10 or 15 years ago. And Jeff Bezos had this idea for Amazon Prime, which for those of you that aren't Amazon customers, you pay, I think, $10 a month basically to get overnight shipping or 2-day shipping on anything you order anywhere in the US at least. So the idea was you pay $10 a month and then you get, no matter what you order, how often you order, you're going to get expedited shipping. And the CFO was adamantly opposed to it. He said, absolutely not. This is going to bankrupt the company. We're going to lose money on customers. And at this point, this is back when Amazon was still doing sort of the land grab of just trying to dominate market share and all that stuff. So, and Jeff Bezos said, no, I'm playing the long game here. Yeah, we're going to lose money in the short term, but long term, it's going to help us. And it turns out that Jeff was probably right, because it seems to have worked pretty well for Amazon now. But the CFO, in the article, talked about how the CFO almost quit. Like, he was so adamantly opposed to the idea, he almost quit because Jeff just wasn't listening, or Jeff, went against his wisdom. So it's just interesting to see examples like that you're talking about. I may not have thought of it as finite versus infinite mindsets, but that's sort of what we're seeing here. Japanese auto companies, Amazon and Jeff Bezos. I'm sure there's a million other examples that we could point to.
Yeah, I think Amazon's a great example. And if you fast forward, they continue to add more and more value to that idea of how do you be a prime customer. And I think they also looked at how do they create stickiness or loyalty from a customer perspective. So if the idea is I'm getting free shipping, well, I'm probably going to go to Amazon first to look for a piece of product. And they started adding Prime Video and a lot of other value-added capabilities to that offering.
Yeah. I want to get to one more question from the audience, and then I've got a sort of a closing question for you, Bruce. But this one's from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, what happens if the executives don't like the influence you have as someone who's lower? How do you approach that conversation? So let's just say I'm lower in the organization. I'm trying to create that alignment and that just that overall alignment that you were just describing before, sort of bottoms up or from the bottom up the organization. How do you approach that, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the advice I would give is continue to point back to the North Star. And so what's the North Star for the organization and for this executive? And so what is this executive trying to achieve? What is this leader trying to achieve? What's the broader organization trying to achieve? And really getting a very good understanding of what that North Star is. Part of the problem is in many organizations, there's not shared meaning around that North Star. So what I would suggest for that individual is if they're having trouble with a given executive because that executive is not appreciating the influence that they're having, is take a step back. Try to create shared meaning around what is the North Star? What are we trying to achieve collectively? And how do we do this collectively? I think the leader, that leader in the case, may not have a mindset that this individual is coming from positive intent. And so this individual may need to step back a little bit and really demonstrate that they are coming from positive intent.
Yeah, very interesting. Well said. So what, I'm going to ask you a two-part question to sort of tie this all together and to close out the conversation. And I'll ask it from the perspective of if I'm an executive, and then I'll ask it from the perspective of if I'm not an executive, I'm lower in the organization. But what closing advice would you have to help get executives on board and more supportive of change? So all the stuff we're talking about sounds great, but how do we get started? What are some first steps that we could take either as an executive or as a someone lower in the organization?
Yeah, so I would answer that in a couple ways. First, I think we all recognize that business is becoming more digital, whether it's AI, whether it's big enterprise systems, and whether that digital is internally focused or externally focused. Externally focused meaning we're creating more data products and we're looking for more revenue generating products that are in the digital space as opposed to in the hard product space. So business is becoming ever more digital. I think one of the mindset shifts that we would propose to executives to start with is to really understand that leadership is becoming even more human-centric, that this idea of a digital becoming more business, don't get lost and believe that then I can be more aloof, I could step back, potentially even use AI to help lead my organization. Leadership is becoming much more human-centric. This idea of start weaving in the power of leading through influence, the power of leading through alignment, and start with yourself. That's the advice that I would give executives.
Yeah. And here I was secretly hoping you would say that AI would just solve all this for us, but you're saying that is not true.
It may solve a lot of business implications, but at a leadership level, the human-centric nature of it's not going away. It's only getting more prevalent.
All right.
And I would say it's probably going to be a big differentiator going forward. So how leaders lead might be one of the most important things on how successful organizations are writ large, as well as against their competition.
Yeah. It's a great point, because you cannot chat GPT that, all the stuff you're talking about here. You can't just automate it or use technology to somehow help you
Right.
figure it out. You're right. It's something that I don't think will ever be automated or made any easier. So the ones that can do it well are going to have a distinct advantage. I know when your colleague Julie was on here, she was very forthcoming and transparent about resources you guys have available. And if I want to learn more about Karrikins and or executive alignment, what are some best ways for us to do that?
Yeah, we've got a rich set of content on karrikinsgroup.com. So feel free to go out there. There's a spot on the website called Coffee Break Corner, which has all of the recordings that we've made with various webinars. We expose a lot of our research, our methodologies, our approaches. So go out there. We look at how we approach our work. We have our behavior change model out there. We have what we call our diamond triangle model, which is more of a meta model that a lot of our work fits within. So our website's a great place to start. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll post my email address, and happy to have a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, Bruce is tagged in this post. You can follow him there. If you want to go to Karrikins Group, just to clarify for the audience too, it's spelled with 2 R's. So it's Karrikins, Karrikins Group. So if you Google it or just type karrikinsgroup.com, that's how you'll find the website there. And it looks like Kate, at least on LinkedIn, Kate dropped in the chat the website as well. So you can follow that link there too.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate you being here today. This was a great conversation, something that oftentimes gets overlooked. It doesn't get enough attention, in my opinion. I think we focus way too much on technology and bells and whistles and stuff like that. And we don't talk enough about sort of the core fundamental components of change, which is what you're talking about. So I really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate the ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to the audience for all the great questions here. Great turnout today and great questions. So thank you for that. Again, you can find this interview next week on our complete episode of Transformation Ground Control. We'll edit this, we'll polish it up, we'll add some more stuff. Not that this needs polished. This was perfect, Bruce. We're not going to have to change anything on this part, but we will add some stuff to the beginning and end just to make it a complete episode. And be sure to check that out at transformationgroundcontrol.com. If you like this content, if you like this discussion, there's a lot more of these sorts of discussions at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So be sure to check that out. We do this live discussion in the live podcast format every week, same time, same place. So thank you for being part of our live podcast production here as well. So you're sort of going down in history because now you're permanently part of the podcast that comes out next week. So thanks everyone for being here. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.